thinking about design. How do we get from our mycelium,
our substrate,
myceliated substrate, to an actual form that we can say, wow, this is a mycelium sculpture, or this is a mycelium material? There is obviously a design part that we need to think about. So in this little section, we're going to explain to you different parameters that you need to think about when you're finding a mold, or creating a mold, or designing a mold for your material.
So we tend to use, when we're making like plant pots, for example, we tend to use packaging material.
Which is what we will show you in this class.
Yeah. For example, this is a food container. It's a good material because it's plastic, it's flexible, you can poke holes in it easily, and it has the form that we're looking for.
And I'm sure you can find many takeout containers and food containers in the recycling bin that you can salvage and use them for a design purpose instead of like creating more waste materials. So that's a really important thing to think about also when you're creating a mold, is that you'll be able to use it many times, or as many times as possible, especially because we normally need to use something that is not organic, or like it's synthetic, so that we can extract our material from there. Because if you use something like wood, for instance, the mycelium will actually start to eat the wood, which is really interesting if that's part of your design process. But if you want to remove the object from the mold, putting it into a wooden mold is not going to be possible. The mycelium is going to grow into the mold.
Another thing to think about is when putting the material inside, when taking the material out of the mold, the material might begin to stick around the edges. So that's why we'll have to have a smooth, finished surface. The material is also humid and still quite fragile. So when designing, it's always better to have a bit of an angle rather than just like a straight up vertical wall. Other things to think about are how strong the material is, because you're going to be wanting to compress it quite a lot. So if the walls are quite flimsy, then you're going to have a bulge on the outside of the mold, and that's not going to be what you want. Other ways of prototyping molds are 3D printing. This is a bit of a more time-consuming process. In this case, for example, the material is super rigid, so it's a very good way of compressing and getting a nice compressed piece of mycelium, a myco-composite. It also has the air holes. So this is something that's also important to consider, because the mycelium is going to need to breathe throughout the mold.
So mycelium breathes, like us, oxygen. They need this chemical to be able to grow really healthy.
So for example, if only one part of the mold had an air hole, then the rest of the mycelium might not grow. So in order to get uniform growth, you're going to have a number of different air holes throughout the mold.
You could also use silicone, and either you can cast your own silicone mold if that's part of your practice, or you can simply buy some kind of cake mold or decorative mold. Why is this nice to use?
It's much easier to remove the mycelium in its flimsy state from the mold. That's why the flexibility is quite nice. One thing to consider though is that when you're compressing, it does tend to move a little bit, so it's a little bit more of a tricky process.
But it creates a really smooth surface, so if that's something that you're looking for aesthetically or for its functional properties, that you might want to consider either purchasing a silicone mold or testing out creating a silicone mold out of a form that you already want to create into a micro object.
It is also possible to use wooden molds, but in this case you would coat, or you would place a piece of plastic wrap or cling film inside to prevent the mycelium from touching the wooden surfaces.
You could also use wax paper, which is like a little bit more eco-friendly if you're trying to avoid so much plastic in the lab, which we will go into briefly about sustainability in the lab space. It's a really important topic. And if you want to create really big pieces, like the surfboard that Jess is working on,
Well, that we are working
on. Because of the size of the vacuum, this had to be cut into 3 separate pieces and then assembled together afterwards. And as you can see, there's a lot of micro holes, micro pores all over the surface, so that once this is fully compacted with the mycelium material, it can actually breathe and evenly grow all over inside the mold. Et voilà!